A government of the corporations, for the corporations, and by the corporations. A government of the ignorant, for the ignorant, and by the ignorant.
Right. So basically, I'm going to ad lib for about 10 minutes.
And then
Get warmed up. He's refusing to go first.
Are you speaking first?
Joel, you're not willing to go first?
Don't worry about it. Don't even ask him. He'll freak out.
Okay.
She didn't ask you that. She just.
I'm not going to freak out. I'll just give the same answer I gave you.
What's that?
I found myself on this panel.
I'll talk first.
What the fuck you want? Because I have so much.
I'm just going to basically
I do too.
give a
just
lengthy
wanna know
introduction for
what
like 10 minutes.
context.
What mic are you using?
You say deep state too.
using
Okay,
her mic.
I've given
Yeah,
an
I can use her
introduction to
mic.
the
Yes,
deep
sir.
state in 3
All right,
lectures
Allison,
beforehand.
Can I borrow your mic, please?
If it's okay with them.
But
okay.
maybe
That's what I told
Sanders
her
should
to do.
speak first.
We need to get it in writing, Luke. I'm sorry.
Maybe Sanders should speak first, so his
I
other
am
2
now. I am,
speakers
Joel. Thank you.
will know what to speak about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to design my speech depending on
Yeah, I
what
know
I
what you
hear.
mean. You
Check,
need
check,
to know
check,
what
check,
paint
checking
looks.
the audio, checking the audio.
I don't want to go over. I don't want to.
Check, check.
Yeah.
I don't want to duplicate.
How about his?
Speak.
Check,
Joseph.
check, 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 check.
Hello. Oh,
Yeah, how about now?
so I saw myself.
We're not working then, the cable's not good or something.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Anyway,
You know, so
Sanders is going to
I don't say
start.
What?
And they were saying.
And it's no
they
good
were
there.
trying to-
And what?
They were trying to do it remotely, and it doesn't work.
Oh,
So that's, yeah,
I've seen it done, but it's a ticklish operation. Not with yours.
Tell me what's going on, do you hear anything?
It's not
Check
better,
it,
it's
checking the
just
mic,
different.
checking the audio.
Sanders
Just
works.
tend to be
set up.
different.
Okay, great. Great.
It's just this is set up for
Hey,
female.
That's the mic we're going to use for everybody.
We need that chair. Who's sitting there? Are you sitting there,
Oh,
Joel?
that's, well, you know,
No?
usually they put it on.
Joel, could you get your stuff off that chair? We're going to need it. I have a feeling.
Probably when I'm speaking,
Okay, Joe.
probably both of us will move because we're gonna. You're
I shouldn't
having
have
some-
Mic around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna move
There you
over
go.
too.
Can we start?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to Deep State 2.0 against anti-Semitism but critical of Zionism. And give yourselves a round of applause just for showing up today. My name is Sander Hicks. I'm a peace activist. I'm an author. I'm a 9/11 truth activist. I'm with the Truth Action Project here in New York City. I'll tell you a little bit about that as I introduce the panel. We have here flying in from California just for one day of the conference, Ms. Allison Weir, author of Against Our Better Judgment. First time at the Left Forum, never been here before, has always wanted to be here. Has got a great background as an independent journalist, anti-war person. Hello, welcome. Try to find a seat. Subtitle of her book is The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was Used to Create Israel. And it's a kind of a new issue for me. I've always been more of a peace activist and a 9/11 truth activist. But, and I've always felt that 9/11 truth was like the #1 taboo topic in the country. Until you look at the U.S. foreign policy as it relates to Israel. As you probably know, last September, President Obama passed a giant foreign aid package for Israel. $36 billion over the course of the next 10 years. It's outrageous the amount of foreign aid and military aid that our country gives to Israel. I've read Allison's book cover to cover. I found it to be erudite, well-sourced, careful, scholarly. She also had the guts to publish it herself rather than try to work with bigger publishers, and that's something I admire based on my own experience. I'm also an author. I've done a couple of books. In 2005, I did a book called The Big Wedding, 9/11, The Whistleblowers and the Cover-Up, in which I think I was probably a little bit too conservative about 9/11. You know, having done some corporate media exposure with Soft Skull Press and trying to keep Bush out of office, I'd been on 60 Minutes, and so I think I was trying to keep one foot in the friendly to corporate media mindset. So I was rather, you could say, conservative or cautious about the 9/11 truth thing. But then somebody sent me the unpublished manuscript by Dr. David Graham, a Shreveport activist who was basically killed by the FBI for telling the truth about his experiences. This guy met two of the 9/11 patsies 10 months before 9/11 had an unpublished manuscript he was trying to get attention to. He traveled to D.C., he tried to talk to the 9/11 Commission. And the experience of learning about his story, the experience of confronting the FBI in Shreveport, really opened my eyes to the full truth. Watch the tripwires, sir. Yeah. I wanted to give a big shout out to No Lies Radio, by the way. The reason that we have so much technical spaghetti up here is because we're doing a live simulcast on No Lies Radio, and they are also broadcasting us live on YouTube. So everyone say, hello, YouTube.
Hello, YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. So even though we have a packed room here today, and it's great to see you here, and we also have an interested audience online. A lot of people are watching it online. So in my research as an activist, as a peace activist, as a truth activist, I've come to realize that these two major taboo topics, the 9/11 official story and the story of the U.S.-Israel relationship, they're taboo topics. They're often dismissed as anti-Semitic if you are critical of Israel. That happened very recently for us. Alison Weir was recently attacked in the Forward, the Jewish Forward. Spencer Sunshine did an article on her, and it wasn't reasonable. It didn't pass a certain standard of reasonableness. It wasn't evidentiary. It didn't actually say what was anti-Semitic about anything that Ms. Weir has said. It was really quite brusque. It was really quite defamatory. It showed malice, and it showed a willful disregard for the truth. And I'm choosing my words carefully here because I personally have been sued in my independent publishing background. I know what defamation is. I've been sued for it. I've been accused of it in a Texas court of law. And Spencer Sunshine's piece in the Jewish Forward, I'm not an attorney, but I'm giving plenty of legal advice to Allison. I believe Spencer Sunshine's piece meets the standard for willful disregard for the truth and for malice, clearly biased against this topic, coming from I would say, a right-of-center Zionist perspective. And if you think I'm talking too long, I was asked to ad-lib up here until we're ready to go. So,
Aren't you one of the speakers?
yeah, I am also one of the speakers.
Well.
So I'm merging the moderator-speaker thing.
Good talk.
And, yeah, do you have a question or something?
Yeah, what was Alison Weir's book again?
Oh, sure.
The book that she's come out with?
You want a visual on this? We'll give you a visual. So her book is Against Our Better Judgment, The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was Used to Create Israel. I recommend it. There's nothing anti-Semitic about the book. There's nothing that accuses the Jewish people as a whole of any kind of moral turpitude. And that's something I wanted to make in my opening remarks. The reason this is quite a year for the Left Forum. The Left Forum has gone through, I would say, a crisis of the soul. And it's a very dark night for the Left Forum. The Left Forum should at least, I would say, reach the standard of reasonableness and the standard of civil discourse set out by the Bill of Rights. And if the Left Forum ever stoops to a level of dark authoritarianism in which it does not engage in civil discourse, open debate, and instead veers towards a tyrannical, draconian, authoritarian canceling of panels without reasonable debate, then I would say that we have gone backwards. We're supposed to be the progressives who are progressing in history towards some sort of new standard of liberation, economic justice, social justice, protection of all rights of all peoples, including Palestinian and Muslim peoples, right? So what the Left Forum has done this year has gone backwards.
Does everyone know about that?
Well, that's where I'm going. I'm glad you asked that. One of our panelists is Mr. Joel Simpson. He's here today as an activist, photographer, and I haven't really introduced him properly yet.
That's
I will.
right. That's right. I'm also the official photographer of the Left Forum. So
Right. So Joel Simpson's here. Put your hands together. Yay. And he just, case in point, he just recently learned about the controversy. Annette, can I borrow your flyer? Yeah. So you might see on your chairs, and if you don't, we can give you a flyer here.
It's the same thing? Yeah, same
Same thing. So this is the controversy I would like to comment on briefly and before we move on. I'll tell you this. In the broadest historical context, this conference used to be called the Socialist Scholars Conference. So it used to be a little bit more narrowly defined and a little bit more academic. And it was a huge, huge day of joy when the nascent 9/11 Truth movement got one panel into the Socialist Scholars Conference.
Last year.
No, it wasn't last year.
Oh, okay.
I'm talking about years after years of rejection. This was at Cooper Union, and I remember the joy that Les Jameson and I had when we got one panel into the Socialist Scholars Conference, okay? Hold on a second, let me make my point. So that has changed, that's snowballed, and so last year we had about 5 deep state track panels, okay? 6, great. This year, to the Left Forum's credit, they could probably argue, well, we have allowed certain topics, certain critical of Israel and critical of the 9/11 official story topics, but not others. And for the most part, I think it is a crime against reasonableness and a crime against
Humanity.
free speech, humanity, and it's really contrary, I think, to the core mission of the Left Forum, to be about justice, to be about social justice, I think, to have the courage of the heart, to have a revolutionary consciousness that confronts social taboo. Because in this culture, and in this militarist, patriarchal, all too often pro-Zionist, the tyrannical nature of the Judeo-Christian tradition and not the liberating radical nature of certain world religions, I would say that our culture rules through taboo more than it rules through overt force. So it's the taboos that are enforced on a cultural level that really control minds. And they control minds through a kind of like a soft war against certain ideas, against free thought. So what we're talking about here is, unfortunately, there's been kind of a schism. And this is not the kind of thing that we wanted to happen, but you have to kind of ask yourself, what was the Left Forum thinking? By without discussion, without debate, canceling 4, thank you, 3 and then 4 of the deep state panels. They were produced by Kat McGuire and Cheryl Curtis.
One of the panelists is here in our audience.
That's right.
Barbara Honegger is here.
Well, 2 of the panelists are here, right? Because Jeremy Roth-Kuschel was also a panelist, and Barbara Honegger is here. So thank you for coming, guys.
Extremely,
so suffice to say,
prestigious
if you're
scholars.
interested in this these taboo topics that are even too controversial for the Left Forum, there is a extra panel. You can do 2 conferences in one weekend, people. Tomorrow, there's the Left Out Forum at a location to be disclosed on the No Lies Radio website. And yeah, I was shocked that they would censor, that the Left Forum would censor somebody as credible as Michael Springman, who is a former diplomat from Jeddah. He was observing the CIA, rubber stamping all these Al-Qaeda people in the 80s. He's written a book about it. It's pretty amazing material.
But Senator, those that are being banned, it's because of the 9/11 stuff, or is it anti-Zionism
Can you
stuff?
tell us
Well,
the
that's the
4
big question.
panels, please, that are banned?
That's the big
Because
question.
I don't see Zionism in here. I see more deep state stuff. I'm just curious.
Yes,
Zionism embedded
okay.
in here without it being
The
said.
nature of the accusations. I actually did my homework on this topic. I read 40 pages or so of the correspondence back and forth between Spencer Sunshine originated these complaints based on his views that the content was anti-Semitic. He wasn't saying that 9/11 Truth was the taboo topic. He was accusing, without evidence, these panelists of being anti-Semitic. He didn't like the fact that producer Kat McGuire had produced an earlier event in Brooklyn with Christopher Bolin. Now, I don't want to commit the same. I don't want to get in too much. I don't want to let the topic of Christopher Bolin dominate our discussion today. But I think that he's very controversial. So I can see how the controversy around Christopher Bolin would create problems. However, somebody like Michael Springman, Barbara Honegger, Jeremy Roth-Kuschel are
Richard
years
Gage.
away from the controversy of Christopher Bolin.
And Kevin Barrett. Don't forget
Yeah, Kevin Barrett, PhD.
And Richard
right, there you go,
Gage.
And
Don't
Richard
forget
Gage.
Richard Gage.
Right.
If those want to see the live streaming of the other left forum, write this down. This is
the information you need to see it. You go to noliesradio.org / the word archives in plural / 131236. I'll read that.
No, it's No Lies Radio / Left Forum, and that will allow you to live stream.
It's on the blue sheet.
Everything's on the blue sheet, and also, if I may say, it's not Christopher Berlin that's the villain here. They're opposed to all of them, and it's mostly for our panels. It wasn't the content per se, it's the speakers. So Kevin Barrett in particular, and Tony Hall. Those were the two main speakers, but anybody who talks about Zionism in the context of anything really that's anti-Israel is going to be vilified. So Christopher Berlin is not this weird villain over here.
Right.
Everybody is working together to try to get the messaging out, and some people are taking more direct hits than others, including Allison Weir. Allison and Christopher Berlin are equally reviled by these shadowy figures who are doing all this
That's
work.
Kevin Barrett. What's the problem with it?
Okay, let's take the discussion back to Allison Weir. That's who we're here to speak. Thank you for your comments. And I'm not taking comments right now. Give me 1 second, please. I want to get I know we're going to run out of time. Allison needs as much time as possible. I want to say thank you to Kat for introducing me to this book and recommending that I read it. It was one of the best things you've ever said. I don't agree with everything you say, but I surely agreed with you on this. And then I happened to be flown to Tehran because Kevin Barrett recommended that I be a part of this conference in Tehran, which was a great eye-opening experience. And during a tour of the Iran-Iraq War Museum, I see this tall blonde woman wearing a veil, and I'm like, man, I bet you that's Allison Weir. I bet you the Iranians invited her as well, and it was, and that's how we met. So I'm going to now pass the mic to Ms. Allison Weir.
Thank you. I hope that's the right place for this. Does that sound okay? I think, yeah, is there a real microphone?
No.
Other than, okay, then I'll stand
You're
up
talking to your audience.
and try to project.
Very good.
Yes.
My voice doesn't project well, so remind me when I'm not loud enough, and I'll try to do better.
You're very good.
So I had a few notes to myself. I hope, please remember to turn off your cell phone. I just did that to my own. And I'll be happy to take questions at the end. I have so much to say, I sort of need to go straight through it. I normally speak for about an hour, and I'm trying, today my obligation is to speak for only half an hour. So please let me know if I go over.
You got it.
I'll just start right in. But I'd like to thank the Left Forum for having me, for inviting me, and for having this panel. And I suspect, sadly, that some people might complain to them. So any of you that feel that this was a helpful, useful panel, I hope you'll let them know and thank them for their commitment to free speech, justice, human rights for everybody, and peace. Today I'll specifically be talking about Palestine, Israel, and the United States. In terms, I'll get into anti-Semitism and how that accusation is used a bit, but I just wrote a very long article, it's about 7,000 or 8,000 words, that goes into detail. All of my work is always cited, so you'll see where the information comes from, into detail about how the very word, the definition of anti-Semitism, is being changed intentionally on behalf of Israel. Unfortunately, I don't think they were brought. Did you bring the materials?
Yes. There's a whole stack of materials.
Oh, good. So we have them here at the end of the panel. You can get them. Or there's a table afterwards outside that will have a lot of materials and my books.
Do you want to pass these out? Or?
No.
Okay.
We receive a great deal of reporting, I'm sure, about Israel-Palestine, and so everyone you talk to will bring up, well, what about those thousands of rockets that Palestinians have shot into Israel from Gaza? Every news report mentions thousands of rockets have been fired against Israel from Gaza. That's mentioned. Anytime Palestinians are mentioned, anytime Gaza is mentioned, we hear about Palestinian rockets. Everybody hears about it. It's factual, we should know that information, and we do. But they almost never tell Americans that these are, in the large majority of cases, they're small, homemade projectiles. That's what we're talking about. They usually don't even do any damage. The media give us a statistic of one sort, They say thousands of rockets have been fired, so they give us thousands. It's over a dozen years they've been fired, but they never tell, well, how many Israelis have been killed by these thousands of rockets that we always hear about. The total number is approximately 30 Israelis killed by rockets in the well over 10 years they've been fired. The media just leaves that information out. Fair-minded people, and I do believe most people want to be fair-minded and want the whole story, would ask, well, how many people in Gaza have been killed by Israeli forces during the time that those rockets were fired out? And that number is close to 6,000 Gazans. What many of you know, but the typical American does not know because of media coverage, is that we are getting very filtered coverage on Israel-Palestine from media across the political spectrum. We're getting very filtered information. We hear about Israeli children who have been killed. We often see their parents. We grieve for these children, as we should. We almost never hear about the Palestinian children who've been killed. We don't see their parents, we don't grieve for them, because we don't even know about them. It's my view that we should care and grieve for every one of those children. Americans give Israel $10 million per day. $10 million per day. We have given Israel, a tiny nation, far more than we've given any other country on earth. In fact, on average, per capita, Israelis get 7,000 times more of our money than other people around the world. That makes us responsible for what Israel does. If you look at this chart, you'll see that since 2000, since the round of violence that began in 2000, known as the Second Intifada, which means uprising, 91 Palestinians were killed, 91 Palestinian children were killed before a single Israeli child was killed. But the media consistently tell us that Israel is retaliating. It's actually the opposite. They also don't tell us, well, how were those 91 Palestinian children that Americans never even heard about, how were they killed? What was their cause of death? All of this is well documented. So I counted up the numbers myself, and I discovered that the number one cause of death of those 91 Palestinian children was gunfire to the head. This information largely comes from an Israeli human rights organization. It's not disputed. We just don't know it. My view is that if Americans knew that our money is being used to shoot children in the head, that we would demand that it stop. And if we had done that, if the American public had demanded that that killing stop, then it is quite likely that it would have stopped. It would have stopped. And then all of those other children that were killed afterwards, both the Palestinian children and the Israeli children, could be living today. I think they would be living today if we had done that. But it's too late for those children and for those families who will never be the same. But it's not too late for the children next week, next month, and next year that we can save if we will speak out. Many people ask how I became involved. I don't happen to be Jewish or Muslim or Arab, and for that reason I'm often called anti-Semitic for speaking out on behalf of justice for Palestinians. I knew very little about this issue 17 years ago. I was the editor of a tiny weekly newspaper in Northern California. But then I noticed the media coverage of the Second Intifada. It was in the news a little bit. And so I belatedly in my life decided to pay attention and to just learn about Israel-Palestine. I had been an activist when I was a student against the Vietnam War and for civil rights, etc. Then I'd raised children. So I'd never looked into Israel-Palestine. I thought, well, I think I'll follow the news coverage and really learn about that issue and what's going on. And when I did that, I noticed as a journalist very quickly that we were getting one-sided coverage from the liberal media as well as the conservative media. So we would hear from and about Israelis in great detail, as we should, but I wanted also to hear from and about Palestinians in equivalent detail, which we don't. So I went on the internet and I started to discover what was going on, and I discovered there were excellent news sources from the region itself. humanitarian agencies that are there, Palestinian media, Israeli media. I remember reading an Israeli report by an Israeli academic about what was going on. I had already learned in those early months, this was fall of 2000 and early 2001, I had already learned that Israeli forces were killing largely unarmed demonstrators in large numbers every day, including children. But what I learned from this Israeli academic was that the Israeli military and government had a strategy that they wouldn't kill too many, because if they killed too many, the world might notice and maybe do something about it. So apparently that wasn't too many. But what they were doing is they were injuring multitudes. They injured something like 6,000 in the first month alone, men, women, and children. And because that wouldn't be noticed, that those numbers wouldn't be ever in the media. And what this Israeli academic said, Tanya Reinhardt, I read this many years ago, said that specifically Israeli soldiers were targeting knees and eyes. So with that kind of information and my new awareness that I was paying for that, I decided that I needed to look into it more. It seemed to me, and it still does, that it was the most covered up issue I have ever seen in a nation that is full of cover-ups. This one is longer and more pervasive than anything else I have ever seen. I decided I needed to go over and see for myself what was going on. And so began the most unusual trip I have ever undertaken. Many years before, I had been in the Peace Corps in Afghanistan. In that case, I had a very official support system, the Peace Corps. In this case, I was going to be traveling alone. I had no one organizing me or sponsoring me whatsoever. When I landed on February 8th, I believe it was 2001, I experienced a pang of the disquiet I'd been trying to ignore on that long airline flight. What was it going to be like for me, as a single female American, to wander alone through a largely Muslim land that was in the middle of a violent uprising, and that was at the epicenter of a region that we're continually told by our media is hostile to Americans, and to women in particular? What would it be like for me? Well, as I traveled very randomly and haphazardly throughout the region on that trip and other trips since, I found it was very different. I was welcomed. I was invited to stay in people's homes. I was treated with respect and completely safe. Whenever people learned I was an American, and I always told them that, the response was welcome. Welcome, every time. But I saw much more. I saw that Palestinians were already, in early 2001, living in small prisons within larger prisons. You often couldn't go to the next village over, to go to school, to visit your mother or your children, to go to work. There were Israeli checkpoints in between, in the West Bank and in Gaza. And by checkpoints, I don't mean toll booths. I mean soldiers in combat gear with machine guns. I remember growing used to, almost, in Gaza, arriving at a street corner and seeing Israeli soldiers in a tank with a machine gun aimed straight at you. You hoped they waved you on rather than shooting you, as they had done some people. At night, you couldn't really see those soldiers very well, but you could see the flashlight with which they would signal whether or not you were allowed to continue driving, to continue living. That was routine. That was in the good parts of Gaza. The less desirable parts looked like this. These are all pictures I took myself. These are residential areas full of families. And let me remind you, this was long before Hamas was elected. This was before a single rocket had been fired from Gaza. The media tell Americans, oh, Israel's defending itself from Hamas and from rockets. This was before that time. This is the Tufah area of Khan Yunis in Gaza. That's what it looked like. The West Bank was being shelled also. As I went around that area, crowds of people were coming up to me. There were no other American journalists there. They were smiling at me and welcoming me to their Swiss cheese homes. As I wrote later, at one point there was gunfire quite near. We all ducked and they took me to a safer area. I'm having to go through this quickly because there's limited time. But I saw beautiful agricultural lands in Gaza and in the West Bank that were being destroyed with our tax money. I saw farmers and talked with farmers who had farmed there forever. Their fathers had farmed that land, their grandfathers had farmed that land, their great-great-grandfathers, back generation upon generation, had farmed that land, and now they were destroyed. Their orchards were destroyed, their crops were destroyed. This was early 2001, and I remember thinking, what will they do? How will they feed their children? I wondered. And this was before it got bad. I saw a people and a land being destroyed through our tax money. To me, that's newsworthy. To me, that's obligatory to talk about. And I saw more. I don't like seeing suffering. I don't like seeing children in pain. But thousands of Palestinian children had already been injured by that time. So it was my job to see them. All I had to do was go to the nearest hospital. I saw children with bullets in their backs, in their stomach, in their head. I saw a boy, I don't have his picture here, whose parents were happy to see me because they thought that as an American, perhaps I could help their poor son. I asked the doctor if there was something I could do. Perhaps a surgical team could be flown in, or perhaps their son could be brought to a hospital in the United States. Thank you. But the doctor told me that he hadn't yet found the right time and the right way to tell the parents. But he said their son was totally and eternally paralyzed. So I knew something those parents didn't know. And I wished that I didn't. And now you do too. I remember in the West Bank, I got to a newspaper office and they said a 9-year-old boy was just shot nearby. Maybe you'd like to go see, since I was a journalist. And I thought, no, I wouldn't like to go see. But I did. And I took pictures of his blood. I saw his picture. I saw the living room where there was a wall hanging that had a bullet hole in it that said, I was told, thinking of God makes our hearts grow calm. A quote from the Quran. I saw a plaque over the front door that I could read myself that said, God bless our home. The family, I was told, had moved in 10 days before. This was their dream home. I saw the family photos on the wall, and I saw the parents when they got back from the hospital from their dead son. And I heard the mother and the sisters weeping and weeping. And I saw the father walking around shell-shocked. It looked to me like he was sleepwalking in a bad dream that will never end. There were so many funerals I went to. There were funerals every day. I remember another was for a woman just shortly afterward who had been killed. She had 3 sons, 18, 14, and 12. She'd been killed by the Israeli military. And as I was interviewing people, at one point I found myself walking next to this woman who, it turned out, was the dead woman's neighbor. She told me about her friend. She said just a few days before, her friend had been asking her what it was like to go to college in America, because this woman had gone to college in the U.S. She explained to me, it's every boy's dream in Palestine to go to college in America. So the dead woman's 18-year-old son had wanted to go to college in America. But she said, of course he won't go now. He'll stay home to help with his brothers. And I saw so much more. Then when I went more recently and took more pictures, this is what Gaza looked like the last time I went, parts of it. These are places that were full of people. So when I returned from that first trip, I started an organization called If Americans Knew, to tell every single American in this country that I can the facts about Palestine. Some people call me anti-Semitic for doing that. We also conducted media studies because I feel, you probably agree with me, that the most powerful institution in our country, in any country that is basically a democratic country or a republic, the most powerful institution I feel are the news media, because they are providing the information that people think they know about all sorts of topics, especially international topics. So we looked at how they covered deaths among both populations for Palestine and Israel. To me, again, I'd like to emphasize both populations matter, all human beings matter, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, or nationality. A death is tragic and wrong. So we looked at how they covered it. We especially looked at a subcategory of children's deaths. I think all of us are deeply saddened when we hear that a child has been killed. They're not supposed to be killed. So we looked at that coverage, and the first thing we needed to do was answer this sad question. How many children among both populations had been killed during that first year of the uprising? First impressions are so powerful. How many were covered? Using an Israeli source, we've discovered 28 Israeli children had tragically been killed and 131 Palestinian children. Which of these deaths were covered by our primetime network news shows? Well, they covered Israeli children's deaths at rates up to 13 and 14 times greater than they reported on Palestinian children's deaths. All of this is on our website in much greater detail. We discovered that when an Israeli is killed, especially a child or a civilian, that there are often more than one report on that death. There'll often be a follow-up report. Whereas when a Palestinian is killed, especially a child or a civilian, which most of them are, they're not even covered close to 100%. That's what's going on. In another case, I was living in Los Angeles. I saw a headline on the LA Times website that said that Palestinian violence, fatal violence against Israel, had shattered a period of calm. You'll see this almost every time an Israeli is killed. Allegedly, Palestinians have shattered a period of calm. This was on their website. The newspaper had not yet been printed for the next day, so I called them up, thinking they would not want to print a fallacious, inaccurate headline and news story. And I told them that during a period that they said was calm, 170 Palestinian men, women, and children had been killed. And that during a period they said was calm, 379 had been injured. Their response to me was, we said relative calm, and they hung up the phone. There's so many other omissions. I only have time for about one or two, I guess. There's dissent in Israel. We almost never hear about the many Israelis of all different sorts, rabbis, women's groups, soldiers groups that are opposing governmental actions. It's an important phenomenon, and yet Americans are almost never told about these people. Americans most have no idea that there is an extremely active nonviolence movement in the Palestinian territories, in both the West Bank and Gaza, that there are nonviolent marches and demonstrations every single week, often 2 or 3 every single week. And these are very courageous actions because they are virtually always met by extreme violence from Israeli forces. It's also they're often small farm villages and farmers that are doing these things. In a number of cases, people from around the world are joining this nonviolence movement of all backgrounds, all ages and ethnicities and races. There are some Israelis that are coming and joining this, and yet again, it's an amazing phenomenon. I'm sure many of you have seen it and been there. And yet most Americans have no idea what's going on, even with all this coverage of Israel-Palestine. They've killed and injured mostly Palestinians, but some have been Americans. Tom Herndal was 21 years old, I believe it was. Some have been just badly injured, and we don't hear about them either. Another omission of a very different sort, and I especially wanted to get to this since this is the 50th anniversary of this event, but another omission occurred in 2003, not in Palestine, in the United States, something they didn't cover, in the United States, in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, on Capitol Hill. there was a briefing by the Independent Commission on the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty on Capitol Hill. It was chaired by a 4-star admiral who had also been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Also on the panel was a retired rear admiral who had been in charge of the whole legal department of the U.S. Navy. Also part of their commission was a Marine general, and not just any Marine general. This man, Ray Davis, was the highest-ranking Congressional Medal of Honor recipient in the United States. You cannot ask for a higher-level panel to be speaking on Capitol Hill. They announced their findings that Israel had attacked and tried to sink a U.S. Navy ship, that Israeli forces had killed 34 American servicemen and injured over 170. They announced that rescue flights to these men had been recalled by order of the President of the United States. They also announced that this incident, the facts about this incident, had been ordered covered up by the President of the United States. Statements of that gravity made by officials of that high rank on Capitol Hill are newsworthy. And yet about the only place you could read about that was in the Stars and Stripes newspaper, which is the military newspaper abroad. And it's in the Congressional Record in detail. You can read every word. But somehow the Washington Post and Fox News and others missed it. Now let's quickly look at some of the recent so-called Israel-Gaza wars. Here's the one that occurred in 2008-9, sort of over Christmas vacation. These are the numbers of deaths among both populations. As I'm sure you know, that's not what a war looks like. That's what a massacre looks like. That's what a slaughter looks like. Then let's look at the war, more recent war in the summer of 2014. Again, let's look at this and think about how the media covered it. The media covered the, quote, war of Gaza in 2014. They focused on 3 young Israelis who had been abducted and tragically murdered as supposedly the trigger to events that then followed. Well, let's care about both populations and look and see all the people that were killed before that war of summer of 2014. Let's look at both populations from the beginning of the year. And we notice in January, Palestinians were killed, including a child. But that's not mentioned. Then we look at the next month, February, and more Palestinians were killed, but apparently that's not mentioned. Then the next month, more Palestinians, including another child, are killed, and that's not mentioned. Then we get April, there's 1 Israeli soldier and another Palestinian. Then May, still more Palestinians were killed, including 2 children. Yet none of that is mentioned about the lead up to this war. The first time we get any attention are the 3 Israelis. And then we have the onslaught that followed. Now, as I mentioned, the media say, well, what led to this, Israel was retaliating against the abduction of 3 people and murder. Well, let's see, were any Palestinians forcibly removed and imprisoned by Israelis before this time? Let's look from the beginning of the year through June, and we find, yes, over 2,000 Palestinians, but they also are not mentioned. When I began to look into this so late in my life, I began to read books and to try to understand how did this all start, where did it really begin, where did the violence initiate, and why does the U.S. have this special relationship with a tiny country that has almost no natural resources? Well, what I discovered is that, and I think many of the people in this room might share this with me, when I was born, there was no Israel. When I was born, it did not exist. There was Palestine. When I was born, it was under the British Empire. Before that, it had been under the Ottoman Empire. So where did the Israeli-Palestinian conflict come from if there was no Israel when I was even born? Well, some people are led to believe that it's been going on thousands of years. That's often repeated, and people repeat thinking it's true. Well, it's easy to find out the facts on all of this. It's really very easy. And it turns out that Palestine, in the late 1800s, was at peace. At that time, it was under the Ottoman Empire. it was what we would call a multicultural population, in that it was about 80% Muslim, about 15% Christian, a little under 5% Jewish, all living on land that is sacred to all three faiths. And they had been living on that land, these three populations and others, for centuries. It's very evident. The historical record is very clear. They were not at war. There was not the conflict and the killing that we see today. So what caused that? Well, it turns out it was a political movement, not a religious movement, a political movement that began in Europe in the late 1800s and was also very active in the United States, starting at that same time. A movement called political Zionism. All of us have heard of capitalism, socialism, fascism, and could at least loosely define all of those. And yet, Zionism is an extremely important political ideology, and most people have not even heard of it. If you use the word Zionist, most people don't know what it means. It means an adherent of a movement that wanted to create a Jewish state in Palestine, and that now wants to maintain a preferentially Jewish state in Palestine. Remember that this was started at a time when Palestine was, of course, an ancient land that was already fully inhabited, and its population was 95% not Jewish. So this would entail a major ethnic cleansing to accomplish this, to create that. So it's also important to note that at this time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and for many decades, the majority of Jews around the world, including in Palestine, including in Britain, including in the United States, were not in favor of Zionism. They were not in favor of it. Some were actively opposed to Zionism at that time and for many decades. Now, I'll be emphasizing the U.S. connection. That's the topic of my talk, and that's the topic of my book that I hope you'll get. It began this movement began in the U.S. much earlier than most of us were aware, and was very active much earlier than many people know. By 1910, there were already 20,000 Zionists, and it was already becoming a movement to which politicians were listening, especially in the large eastern cities like this one. In 1914, there was an especially important development. A prominent Boston attorney named Louis Brandeis of Brandeis University became a Zionist. Not only became a Zionist, he became the head of World Zionism. There is such a thing as World Zionism. It had been centered in Europe, and it moved to the United States with Louis Brandeis as the head of it. He was a very prominent, highly respected individual. We still respect many of his legal judgments. He's widely known. He was named a Supreme Court Justice in 1916. So at that point, ethically, you're supposed to resign your board affiliations, etc. So he outwardly resigned his leadership of World Zionism. This was publicly known that he was leader. So he resigned that, but secretly he continued to lead World Zionism. In my book, you'll see my book is literally half citations. So everything I'm saying here, you can go and see my source and evaluate my source for yourself. So he would have his loyal lieutenants would come into the Supreme Court chambers. One of them was Felix Frankfurt, another future Supreme Court justice, would come into Brandeis' Supreme Court chambers, report on their activities, and he would give them directions to go and carry out. This was highly improper, which is probably one of the reasons they kept it secret. But there's even more, and this part I will give you my citation for, because if you don't like it, you can blame, I'm just the messenger of this information. Among the many books I read, and I have shelves and shelves of books, I always read the footnotes and try to confirm their information, then order more books. One of the books was called Israel in the Mind of America, published by a mainstream respected publisher, by a mainstream establishment author who tilts towards Israel. He's sympathetic towards Israel, Peter Gross. So in his book, this accepted establishment book by this establishment author, Peter Gross, who tilts towards Israel, he says that there was a secret society operating in the United States of which Louis Brandeis was a leader. The name of it was the Parashim, a secret episode in American Zionist history. Well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So that's what Gross said in his book. So I was shocked to read that, and I wondered, well, what is his evidence for this? What is his source? I went to the footnote. I got his source. I've posted it online for everyone to read. It was from a scholarly journal, the American Jewish Historical Quarterly, a peer-reviewed journal. In 1975, had this article. I looked at who was the author, who had written that article. Was this a reliable scholar? Well, it turns out to be an Israeli professor at a mainstream Israeli university. Dr. Sarah Schmidt had written the article. I have more information about this in my book. This was, looks to me quite confirmed. They would go around the country spreading Zionism. They especially recruited young Harvard students, ambitious students, and they would spread the Zionist agenda throughout the United States so that our nation and so that our population would support Zionism. In 1915, a leader of the Parashim, Professor Horace Callan from the University of Wisconsin, suggested and planted this suggestion that the British would benefit from a declaration in support of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Any of you who have heard of the Balfour Declaration may be connecting that. I'll get to that. But the rest of you, if you're the way I was, would wonder, why would the British benefit from endorsing a Zionist colonization of Palestine? Palestine, as I mentioned, was not under the British Empire, it was under the Ottoman Empire. So what did this have to do with Britain? Well, if you look at what was going on in 1915, you discover it was the Great War, as they called it. They didn't know even greater one would be coming. And massive carnage and death. The British were in danger of losing that war. In the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British casualties were 60,000 men. They were desperate. They wanted the U.S. to come and join this. The American population was that thing that we're told is a bad thing, isolationists. They did not want to go to a foreign country to kill and be killed. In fact, Woodrow Wilson was elected to a second term of office with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But the British government, of course, wanted us to join the war on their side. And the Zionists in Britain, especially Chaim Weizmann, well known, who had entree to the British government, went to them. And he said, well, we can help you get the U.S. into the war. We can help you win the war if afterwards, when you're in charge of Palestine, you sort of facilitate our movement, our colonization of Palestine. This was written about, this is the claim that he made. This is written about in a number of books by pro-Israel authors. I'm just a deliverer of this message. This was called a gentleman's agreement. So this is how the Balfour Declaration was obtained by the Zionists. It's a mild declaration, but it basically opened the door to the British support of Zionist colonization and basically eventually ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I'm jumping ahead now because I know I've limited time. But today, the Israel lobby, if you go to our website, you will see it consists of dozens of organizations with large budgets. If you go to the website, you'll see the list, you'll see the links where they themselves talk about how they support Israel and what their annual budget is. AIPAC has an annual budget of something like $50 million.
How many?
50 million.
50.
50. And that's just one of many. But it's the one that most people that have heard of any of them have heard of. Now, the precursor to AIPAC actually came in 1939, the American Zionist Emergency Council. This, by 1943, had a budget of $500,000 when a nickel bought a loaf of bread. It was a huge amount of money. Within not too many years, it maneuvered itself into access to a far larger fund that in today's dollars was the equivalent of about $1 billion. $1 billion with which to propagandize every sector of American society. And they used their money well. They had written documents, they had annual reports. This isn't archaeology, this is easily known. They targeted congressmen, Christian clergy, editors, professors, both business and labor. They targeted every sector of the political spectrum. They specifically targeted Jewish war veterans to propagandize even more intensively the Jewish population. They created hundreds of committees around the United States. They made books that were bestsellers. They called other books anti-Semitic, as they still do. During all of this time, amazingly and interestingly, there was considerable and diverse opposition to Zionism from a number of sectors. Some of the major Christian leaders, most respected pastors, opposed Zionism for religious and moral reasons. Some of the Christian ministers in the Middle East that were very famous, one was from what became the American University of Beirut, went to the Paris peace talks to specifically argue against Zionism and to advocate on behalf of self-determination for the Arab peoples, for all people. A Dead Sea scholar named Miller Burroughs wrote a wonderful book in which he told about the responsibility of American Christians to support Palestinian rights. For writing that book, he was called anti-Semitic, even though he had a life history of interfaith relations and was very opposed to all bigotry. There were many Jewish activists that were also opposing Zionism intensively. Two of them are Elmer Berger and Alfred Lilienthal, both of whom wrote excellent books, especially Lilienthal, but they never had the kind of money, never even close to the kind of money that the Zionists had. The diplomats, the governmental establishment of the U.S. opposed Zionism because they said it would hurt the United States strategically. They wrote numerous memos and reports. The Intelligence Department, the military, the State Department, all recommended that we not support Zionism, largely for strategic reasons. But some of them also pointed out for reasons of principle that we should not support it. Accusations of anti-Semitism were used against all of those people, as they still are today, as a way to silence people, to marginalize them, to prevent access, as being done against me, as has been done against other people. A former Israeli Knesset member and minister, Shulamit Aloni, a few years ago on Democracy Now!, spoke very honestly about what Israel does. I'll just read some of it. This was, again, in an interview with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!. This Israeli speaker said, the use of calling someone anti-Semitic, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong, she said, and has a lot of money, and the ties between Israel and the American Jewish establishment are very strong. They have power and money and the media. Their attitude is Israel, my country, right or wrong. You can see this video from Democracy Now! For yourself. It's quite true. During the war of Israel was created through warfare. Its war of 1947 to 49 is called its War of Independence. The Palestinians call it al-Nakba, the catastrophe, because it was a massive humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands, probably, at least 750,000 people.
700,000.
750,000 or 1 million people were ruthlessly ethnically cleansed through multiple massacres. Most Americans didn't know about it. The American media then as now were largely embedded in Israel with Zionists. But some Americans, one in particular, tried to tell the American public about it. And the woman who did that was named Dorothy Thompson. She was called by the Britannica one of the most important and famous female journalists of the 20th century. She was considered the most powerful woman in the United States after Eleanor Roosevelt. She had a newspaper column that was all over the United States, a radio program listened to by millions of Americans. And yet, today almost nobody has heard of her. She was such a celebrity that there was even a Hollywood movie loosely patterned on her life in which she was played by Katharine Hepburn, a Broadway play in which she was played by Lauren Bacall. Why is she not known today? Well, this is not why. This is one of the reasons she was famous. She was a wonderful journalist. In the 1930s, she was a foreign correspondent in Germany. She was one of the first journalists to raise the alarm about Hitler. She was the first foreign correspondent to be ejected by Hitler. So she was very sympathetic to Zionism. Very sympathetic. Then when she went to Palestine to see what was going on for herself, and she saw hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees living in squalor, destitute, dying in large numbers, very harsh conditions, and in those days and still, she began to speak about them and to write about them. She even eventually made a documentary about them. And for trying to tell Americans about these people, about Palestinians, she lost her radio program, she lost her newspaper column, she lost her livelihood, and she lost her fame. As her biographer put it, she was erased from history. Today, if I tried to write about these things that I'm telling you about, the obvious thing would be to have an article in American History magazine. This is, these important incidents in American history. Well, if I tried to do that, it would not get published. How do I know? Because several years ago, our organization tried to place a paid advertisement, a sort of small one, in this magazine for another book, not to do with me, a book by a 90-year-old retired congressman, his memoir. But the owner, Eric Weider, said to us that because our organization was anti-Israel, they would never publish any paid advertisements by us in American History magazine. Or, he volunteered, in any of the magazines owned by Weider Associates, which is virtually every popular history magazine in the United States.
Who was the congressman?
Paul Finley. Now let's, again, please feel free to stop me if I must stop.
Can you do 5 minutes more?
Okay, that will do it. Thank you. Just to quickly update this, my book only goes to 1950. My next one will go to the present, but the U.S. invasion of Iraq that has led to so much. In Israel, they very openly wrote about that this was conceived by 25 neoconservative intellectuals, pushing President Bush to change the course of history. In Israel, they write about many of these things quite openly. It's an excellent source of information, Haaretz in particular. In that same article, this was from Haaretz in 2003. Again, let me give you the sources. I'm quoting other people that were quite accurate in what they said. The same article quoted Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist. So a quote of Thomas Friedman was in Haaretz, in which he said, "It's the war." He's talking about the war against Iraq. "It's the war the neoconservatives wanted. It's the war the neoconservatives marketed. Those people had an idea to sell when September 11th came, and they sold it. Oh boy, did they sell it. So this is not a war that the masses demanded. This is a war of an elite. I could give you the names of 25 people, all of whom are at this moment within a 5-block radius of this office, who, if you had exiled them to a desert island a year and a half ago, the Iraq War would not have happened." Those same people are pushing for more wars. So we had the Iraq War, and the misery and tragedy and carnage of that war led to the destabilization of the whole surrounding area and was very related to the rise of extremism. Many people have noted that. So we have Iraq destroyed. Now we see what's going on in Syria. We have a Hillary email in which she wrote, "The best way to help Israel is to help the people of Syria overthrow the regime of Bashar Assad." So now we see Syria looking very much like Gaza. And we see Syrian refugees looking very much like Gazan refugees. And we see now tragedy in Europe. We see children being killed in Europe. And we see a little Syrian boy who didn't make it there. and a little boy in Gaza, also killed. All of these we could stop. And now they're looking at Iran. A few years ago, there was a full-page advertisement in the New York Times, I was here and saw it in person, against Ahmadinejad, a very frightening, satanic look. How do we stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons and funding terror? Well, all our intelligence agencies say they're not developing nuclear weapons, but this was the ad that was placed in as part of this campaign to demonize Iran so that we will now do damage against a whole new country.
There's AIPAC right
Let's
there.
look at who made it. I have the logos at the bottom are hard to read, so I made the list of who put this ad in. I'm not making this up. They signed it. They publicly, instead of doing it behind the scenes as they often do, made it very clear to us who did it. That's who placed that ad in. That's part of that's the campaign to get us to now do damage against Iran. We haven't yet attacked Iran physically. Hopefully we won't, but economically we have. We've committed really what's probably legally an act of war by a bit of a blockade. This is what's going on. This is when I started, bad as it was, it wasn't nearly as bad as it is now. It's time for all of us to overcome the censorship, to stop being afraid of being called anti-Semitic, because the minute you say the word Palestine, you'll be called that name. And to get the real facts out to everybody we can, because it's our nation that's making all of this possible. We're the only ones, I feel, we're the ones that can stop it. Thank you very much.
Hey, that was great. Really good job. Yeah. Can I borrow your microphone? Thank you. Can I borrow that backpack? Thank you so much. Can you help me pass out some petitions? Great. Thank you, Allison Weir. That was really great. Very efficient. We said we would give her 30 minutes, but we gave her 50 minutes. So that seems judicious. We have another speaker coming up. As a transition, yeah. Thank you. Are you going to
take 5 minutes? I have to go to the bathroom.
Okay, great. I need 5 minutes. That's good, Joel. So Joel needs me to ad-lib for 5 minutes, which is great. It's perfect because we have new T-shirts. Yeah, I wanted to talk about the T-shirt. I wanted to talk about the petition. What Deb and I are a part of, and Joel is a part of, is this new group called Truth Action Project, which is, in my opening remarks, I talked about the taboo against talking about Israel and the U.S. relationship. I talked about the taboo against talking about the 9/11 official story. These are two issues that combine into each other. We know now that there is a recently released FBI report, thanks to a Freedom of Information Act, about the 5 dancing Israelis. East Rutherford, New Jersey police and the FBI investigated why there were Mossad affiliated Israeli movers celebrating the 9/11 attacks. So, here, you can borrow some clipboards.
When you say movers, what do you mean movers?
Okay, there were people posing as movers with a Israeli-owned moving company in New Jersey, and they were observed celebrating the 9/11 attacks. Right outside the Statue of Liberty in Liberty State Park, East Rutherford police were contacted, and these people were arrested and detained and questioned for numerous months. They were never prosecuted. They were released back to Israel. They were on Israeli television. They were celebrated as heroes. Many people believe that they were a part of some sort of Israeli intelligence operation. They were questioned by police. Why were you celebrating and high-fiving each other and holding up cigarette lighters like it's a rock concert while the towers were burning? And they said, well, we were there to document the event, which clearly shows some sort of foreknowledge. There was also an Israeli intelligence operation in Florida tracking the 19 hijackers. A different operation. These were the art students. They were infiltrating government buildings, selling art. It ties into what Allison said about the 25 neocons. Thomas Friedman and other journalists have talked about the 25 neocons that created the Iraq War. They celebrated the 9/11 attacks. People like Paul O'Neill's, the Treasury Secretary under Bush, talked about how Rumsfeld and Cheney were instantly talking about attack Iraq right after 9/11. Right. So the whole neocon agenda, which involves, as you know, a lot of dual citizens, people that have Israeli and U.S. citizenship. talking about people like Dov Zakheim at the Pentagon. Could go on and on. Michael Chertoff. Personally, I've confronted Jerome Hauer, who's a very interesting cat. He was Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management Supervisor at one point, very close to Stephen Hatfield, the official person of interest that the FBI wanted to talk to for like 6 years about the anthrax attacks. I could go on and on about that, but since we're short on time, I'll just say that my interview with Jerome Hauer is on sanderhicks.com. It's an audio interview I did years back. I talk about it a lot in my book, Slingshot to the Juggernaut. Does everybody, what we're passing out is a way that we can take action about this neocon cover-up. This is not a solution to every single political problem in the world. Some people say, well, I want to focus on Trump. And we say, hey, this is what we're doing with the Truth Action Project here in New York. It's a new group. It was started by Richard Gage and the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're asking you to help us put pressure on Congress and sign a petition. If you need a pen, raise your hand. I can give you a pen.
I'm going to sign it now and hand it in.
Yeah, we'd like you to sign it now and hand it in. If you need a clipboard or a pen,
Those look like
they are pens. They have black ink. They are legally, it's a great way to grow the group. A lot of people say, why are you doing this now? We say, hey, a lot has changed in the last year. 60 Minutes covered the 28 pages issue, which has to do with the funding of the attacks. And so this is a great way to actually take action here. And
That will be covered in the left out forum.
that's right, left out forum. There's also another 9/11 Truth panel in this room after this panel is over. Jeremy, do you have a quick question or comment?
Yeah, the Israeli moving vans, there were also ones with apparent bombs in them that were arrested at the George Washington Bridge, reported on mainstream television and then whitewashed.
Yes, thank you.
And Mary Baraka wrote about it in a poem for which he got excoriated.
Okay, now we have to go to our next speaker. His name is Joel Simpson. He is a photographer and an activist. He's a part of the New York City Truth Action Project. Please put your hands together and welcome Joel.
Thank you. Do I get the microphone?
That's excellent.
All right.
Is it working?
Sander, thank you so much. And Allison, wow, I am humbled and I'm grateful. It's amazing. You're so courageous and you put it together so well, and you had all of the illustrations and you have history and you've been around. I'm going to pass out two things that I don't have enough copies of for everybody because I was having printer problems. But I'm also going to pass out a deep state contact list. If you put your name and email on this and put bib for bibliography, if you don't get one of these, I will email it to you. This is my bibliography that I've been reading for the last 2 years that has completely turned me around. So, and I'm going to be referring to some of the works on this sheet. Let me be sure I have one for myself. All right, yeah, just pass it out, and here's the contact list. And then I'm also going to pass out, I have very few of these, so I don't expect you to take them, but just share. This is the Israel's cycle of exchange with core hegemons, the great power center corporations of the world. So I'm going to pass these out too. Maybe we'll start that from the other side. All right. And I'm going to begin with a quote, okay? Understand your audience, the opinions, attitudes, and emotions that make them tune in or turn off. We pinpoint language that garners support and inspires action. You deliver a message that resonates and drives results. This is on the website of Frank Luntz's company, Luntz Global. Luntz is the Republican consultant who Israel has employed to reframe their reactions to the conflict with Palestinians. And it was Luntz who said, stop talking about needing land for Jewish immigrants and start talking about all the bombs coming in and how you're victims. Okay, so that's where this comes from, an American, Republican-American consultant. And you can go check it out. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about, I put a few terms on the board, and I realized that psyops is absolutely key, because whenever we talk about the media prejudice the media orientation, the media censorship, we're talking about PSYOPs. PSYOPs is a recognized CIA and other subversive organizations' technique, among many others, to control the population. Now, as Doug Valentine, who's on the list with the CIA as Organized Crime book, which was his follow-up to the Phoenix Project book, right? Okay, thank you. All right, Doug Valentine, highly recommended. It is an eye-opening book on the dirty tricks, the murders, the corruption, the way the CIA has brought people in countries where they're trying to control over to our side, making them agents, spies for them, essentially. Okay, so you can. So Doug Valentine describes all this in the CIA as Organized Crime, which you can see there.
Butter. You can hear Doug Valentine talk about his own book.
Absolutely.
Anytime you want on the Guns and
Thank you very much. He was interviewed about a month and a half ago, right, by Bonnie Faulkner. It was a great, great source of information. Okay, now, I have spoken a number of times about the deep state, but this is Deep State 2. So I don't have to, I assume I don't have to give a background of Mike Lofgren and the wonderful Peter Dale Scott, what is the deep state? No, in fact, since this was about Israel-Palestine, I quick reviewed Jeff Halper's wonderful, profound book, War Against the People. And you may know Jeff Halper as the head of the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. A Brooklyn native, he is an Israeli citizen. He's thoroughly versed in the ways of Israel, obviously speaks Hebrew. He's a world figure. And he wrote this book, which, as I reread the beginning of it, I found he's describing the deep state without mentioning it as the deep state. He uses a different terminology, which actually takes us to the structure of the global deep state, even perhaps more effectively and less vaguely. Well, Peter Dale Scott is moving through a lot of terms and trying to focus on something that's a moving target and not really terribly organized. And he has a terminology that actually focuses in on it. And I've put some of these terms on the board. All right? So he starts out by talking about the transnational corporate class that's concentrated in the global north or west, that's us, all right, which is the core of a system of world domination and control. From here, from this core area, it manages its globalized circuits of resource flow, globalized production, marketing, finance, and finally capital accumulation, which is their ultimate goal, otherwise known as increased inequality. And as a quick footnote, the cost of inequality, we have Stiglitz talking to us about inequality, but actually a more nitty-gritty result of inequality can be found in Dr. David Ansell's wonderful book from last year called The Death Gap. The Death Gap. He's a doctor in Chicago, which shows that inequality actually costs the greatest victims of it, the poor, 15 to 20 years of lifespan. What? Speak up.
Stand this way because you're getting the video right on your forehead. So stand this where Allison was. For visual purposes.
All right. Oh yeah, we don't need this. Okay, great. All right. So that book is on the list too. Okay, as such, the transnational capitalist class represents a hegemonic power within hegemonic powers. Okay, so if the United States is a hegemonic power, our 1% or 1/10 of 1% is, of course, the hegemonic power within the hegemonic power. Okay, capable of mobilizing the power of the core states, mainly the most powerful states, and supranational institutions when necessary, think NATO, all right, to protect and advance its interests. Okay, now this turns out to be the very definition of the deep state viewed globally. once the capitalist system spread throughout the world without a socialist enemy, eliminating its international rivals, it had no more worlds to conquer, to quote Alexander the Great. So it turned back on its own populations, becoming the endo-colonial power. What a wonderful term, endo-colonial. All right? So when you read Michelle Alexander about the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, that's endo-colonialism. This is Jeff Halper's term. Okay, and then it proceeded to dispossess native populations and the economies of weaker states, such as Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Spain. Okay, these are the targets and victims of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, international capital. Okay, aiming at privatizing hitherto public institutions and squeezing the population, imposing large debts on national economies, basically sucking its wealth out, removing social safety nets, immiserating populations, impoverishing them. Okay? But in order to keep control, they have to build up their militaries, police forces, security agencies, prison systems, and surveillance systems to protect the upper classes from endemic unrest and resistance. So we have new types of wars, securocratic wars for securocratic control. Security and peace, they're things that we think we all want, right? But they've become buzzwords and pretexts for oppression. They have to put down counterinsurgencies, which they do by their process of pacification. Sounds like a benign term, of course, to enforce hegemony of transnational capital. Okay. Meanwhile, this evolves into a total system of social control, which Foucault, who wrote on power, called governmentality. It sounds like a French term, la gouvernementalité. Okay. But we're very familiar with it, whether we use the term or not, while sustaining the fiction of democracy and popular sovereignty. Just as with mass incarceration, the fiction of post-racism had to be sustained. And it's one that the Supreme Court bought and swallowed, right? Insisting that overt admitted racism is the only legal reason for constraining an institution whose outcome, like the judicial system in many instances, is obviously racist. Okay? So on the global scene, the fiction of democracy and popular sovereignty must be maintained, which is why the media will not speak of election corruption. The other series of panels that I'm involved in. Okay? This is actually part of deep state activities. Election corruption and getting the media to refuse to talk about it. That's part of PSYOPs. Okay? So we're all victims of PSYOPs. We're here in order to escape PSYOPs and see through it. Okay? Okay, so they have to maintain their hegemony. They want three ongoing goals: to maintain a domination of the whole world system against counterinsurgencies, against emerging competitors such as the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Korea, and South Africa, and the MINT countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. They have to maintain hegemony over the periphery, the poor countries, and for this I send you to John Perkins' wonderful books, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and the Secret History of the American Empire, which is really kind of the prehistory of where we are today, and to maintain hegemony in their own countries. This results, of course, in huge expenditures in what's called euphemistically defense, but it's really control and domination. And just to give you a quick example, our Pentagon budget, which in 2013 was $640 billion, was 36% of the world total of military expenditure. Not only are we more than every other country. All right. So we have the rise of wars involving semi-state and non-state actors replacing wars between states. There were 73 civil wars, for example, between 1965 and 1999. Civil wars are symptoms of unrest, of the refusal of a population to bow to the hegemony of these rich people. Many of them, if not most, were driven by greed for resources. Civil wars in Africa, as you know, came out of insurgencies who wanted to control the resources of their own countries, rather than having them shipped out to the neoliberal global hegemons. So we have and we also have a dramatic rise of civilian casualties. I'm getting to Israel. New frontiers of coercion, hybrid warfare, the use of conventional plus irregular means of war, terrorism, state terrorism, subversion, the use of criminal sources. If you read Misha Glenny's book, McMafia, you'll see, and this is some time ago, this is like 10 years ago, he has other, you'll see how countries, governments, have made alliances with their local criminal organizations, notably in Japan, China, and Israel, to carry out certain of their agendas. Then we run into the shadow economy of the world arms trade. Huge amounts of money are being spent on arms, which are going to everywhere, so that America is exporting arms, France, Saudi Arabia is buying them, Israel is importing and exporting arms, and for that, look at Andrew Feinstein's book, The Shadow World, the International Arms Trade. All of this is without the acquiescence of the populations of the countries who are spending this money. Okay, so they have to be kept in the dark. All right, what? 10 minutes? I haven't even gotten to the main points yet. All right.
Skip ahead.
10 minutes? We ended at 10 to 12.
Well, we want to leave like 5 minutes for discussion,
We'll see.
which you can dominate.
No, I gotta get to these points. We have to get to Israel. Okay?
You should.
Yeah. Okay, so we have the pretext of the war on terror, right? If you can frighten the population enough, you can get them to acquiesce in these various huge expenditures, in the projects of the core hegemons to dominate the world, to acquire the resources, and to enrich themselves. Now, and he talks about the New World Order. Nothing, quote, nothing in principle now stands in the way of the core hegemons imposing a global order of their own, while securocratic wars in undifferentiated global battle space provide the vehicles of global pacification. This is the new language of the deep state. Now, why Israel? Israel has created its own role, its own value to these hegemons, providing a technology that they've developed through their rather unique project of colonial repression, endo and sort of quasi-exo, depending on how you define the territories, for the past 50 years, 70 years, okay, since the great ethnic cleansing of the Nakba, 700,000 people, which was finally exposed by Israeli historians. Ilan Pape, for example, who lives in Great Britain, and Benny what's his name?
Morris.
What?
Morris.
Benny Morris, thanks. Okay. Now, Israel has leveraged its particular skills in colonizing, excluding, surveilling, and suppressing the indigenous population. into the development and sales of sophisticated weapon systems, military technology, surveillance and security systems, and counter-terrorist tactics. And they've leveraged it into political influence around the world. So Israel, therefore, serves international security politics. This is why our defense industries, our deep state actors, the CIA, the NSA, the Department of Defense, and further along, the banks, which are all protected by the media moratorium on actually exposing what they do, as Allison illustrated so very well. So Israel has carved out for itself a vital role as suppliers of... Okay, I said that. Okay, but interestingly enough, they've gotten a huge amount of aid from the United States for their defense to produce weapons, and then they have sold them to both U.S. allies and U.S. competitors. China, India, and South Africa, especially South Africa during apartheid. Now, I passed out this little table with all these circles, and I just wanted to go over it. So this is a cycle, all right? To maintain Israel's global standing and occupation, and preparedness, okay? So to repress the Palestinian population, Israel serves the hegemons with arms, security, and tactics, and framing. Framing is exactly what you were talking about, getting, and what Frank Luntz advised them about, right? Israel is the victim. That's a frame, all right? That's psyops, and that's for general consumption. And Israel's obviously teaching everyone else to do it too. So the next circle down, defeating and delegitimizing resistance and counter hegemony. Okay, so they have to delegitimize groups like Hamas. They have compromised the Palestinian Authority. Then, thus developing its arms security industries. So Israel has a huge expansion of its arms industries into these incredible devices, these little tiny drones, some of which can go inside your body and do damage to you. I don't know if they can control your mind yet, but drones that have the capacity to decide whether they're going to attack or not. And computer viruses like Stuxnet, which was developed along with the CIA and then used against Iran, and then an even more potent one called Flame, which can stay dormant and then go into action, communicate everything on its target computers, keystrokes, screenshots, listen in on conversations, photograph people in front of it, and then empty out the contents of the computer and disappear. Okay, Israel has developed this. These are very, very nefarious weapons. They're of huge interest to the core hegemons for domination. This is Israeli technology. Okay, and then by doing this, all right, the core hegemons, of course, are in control politically as deep state actors. Israel gets support for its policies of repression because they're so valuable in offering these tools and techniques. And then they continue to repress the Palestinians and expand without any kind of control on them. And then that maintains Israel's global standing, occupation, and preparedness. Completes the circle. All right. So Israel needs the occupation. It's not as if two-state solution, peace, these have no interest for Israel because it's the occupation that is Israel's laboratory of development, which enriches it with the core hegemons serving these hegemons. And it just occurs to me, Israel was put in place via the Balfour Declaration as a settler state, right, to represent British interests against the Ottoman Empire and dominate the Arabs there. And we have T.E. Lawrence as someone who was involved in that. Of course, he took the side of the Saudi Arabs and against the Turks. But Israel was like the advanced person in that area, a settler state. And now they are doing something very similar in terms of supplying technologies to the hegemons who need securocratic control over their domestic dominions and peripheral ones.
A list of the core hegemons?
What's that?
Could you give us a few examples of the core hegemons?
Yeah, the American 1%.
Well,
yeah, our
specific companies. Could you name some companies, organizations, institutes?
They're more national
Give us
interests.
The Koch brothers.
Well, the Koch brothers certainly are part of that complex. Absolutely. I mean, the CIA and the NSA. We have government organizations. We have private organizations. Bechtel and Halliburton. I mean, yeah.
And everyone you're saying is all there, but at the very top of the hierarchy are the banksters. And of the banksters, there are 12 families that basically rule the banks. And probably at least 10 of them are Zionist.
Okay. Yeah, well, there's a confluence of interest. Now, Israel is the most militarized country in the world, spending $15+ billion a year on military, which is 6.5% to 8.5% of its GDP. The U.S., the highest dollar military spender, only spends 4.3% of its GDP. Comparable countries in population to Israel, like Finland, spends 1.8%, Morocco 3.4%, Uganda, involved in a long-term external and internal war, 2.3%, Venezuela, with all of its problems, 1.4%. It's the most conflict-prone state in modern history, with 6 to 7 external wars and 3 major Palestinian uprisings. The first one being 1936 to 39, and then the 2 intifadas, and 166 dyadic militarized interstate disputes and violent military actions of some magnitude with its neighbors over the past 70 years. Now, the alternative to this behavior, to the garrison state and cultural militarism, would be a dubious, according to Halper, a dubious political solution involving existential compromises, land for peace, and the prospect of an Arab demographic takeover. So they're actually fighting the advance of demography. Okay, the U.S. became Israel's patron state really in the 60s, replacing France. There was a time of ambiguity between the 50s and 60s. By 1982, however, the U.S. was funding 37% of Israel's defense budget, which gave Israel the platform on which to develop its next stage of its arms strategy. From arms independence, where they had to make their own arms, they invented the Uzi, for example, to niche filling, developing and marketing advanced subsystems or add-on technology to military hardware. The first Zionist paramilitary unit, by the way, was in 1909. It was called Hashomer, the Guard. It was hired to evict Arab tenant farmers and protect Jewish settlers who replaced them. And it marked the beginning of the Arab-Jewish conflict. So Israel has developed an advanced mode of secularization, which they call the matrix of control, and it's used to control its indigenous populations, is the overall term. And this was transferred and outsourced to the Palestinian Authority after the Oslo Accords in 1993. This is why we see the Palestinian Authority as such an effectual leader. Then, following the declaration of the global war on terror by the Bush administration after 9/11, Israel's extensive experience in dealing with Palestinian terror, in quotes, came into high demand across the world, and it began exporting its matrix, offering an effective model of counterinsurgency, stabilization, and long-term pacification. So let's skip ahead here. AIPAC's influence became prominent in the 70s. The goal of hegemons is full-spectrum dominance and control, and Israel made itself the go-to country for this technology. So we have what they call C4 ISTAR. This is command, control, communications, and computers plus high-tech target acquisition. And then there's another complex called MISSILE, military, internal security, surveillance, intelligence gathering, and law enforcement. And then thereafter, total information awareness. These are military terms. And Halper says, yeah, you have to get into the military mindset, which is something that we humanists and leftists try to avoid. But he's done it. And the bulk of his book actually consists of describing Israel's programs. I'm just giving you basically the first third of the book here, mostly. Okay? All right. Okay, so Israel has carved out for itself its macro niches of pacifications, including weapons of hybrid warfare, including securocratic control, both conventional weapons of war, planes, artillery, missiles, anti-aircraft, anti-aircraft, but it's developed an extensive high-tech industry in weapons of hybrid warfare, surveillance, drones, large and small and micro, combat drones, robotics, mini-satellites, passive and active defenses for armored vehicles, small munitions, and the tools of cyber warfare, like the in post-combat pacification, security, and policing technology, where militaries and police blur. Genes. Okay, so this is the world in which Israel is excelling of the world who are interested in world domination. Sounds like developing it, all the better to maintain dominance over the Palestinians while offering the technology to the rest of the world. Major and mid-level and minor hegemons all become their clients. Wonder this Congress. And with that, I'll end.
Great, thank you, Joel. You've been such a lovely audience, but we want to give the tech guy in about will be, it's easy down tables of normal Marxist stuff, and you'll find some really cool stuff down on the right. Oh, thanks a lot. Truth Action Project, 911tap.org. To the 4,000 people online watching us live on YouTube, thanks to No Lies Radio.
100% are Jew.
You can comment, you can repeat it.
Okay.
Ironic when he says that Jews.
So,
No, of me.